You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've got some breaking news here as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. We have another unexpected rebuke of the Trump administration in a 7-2 ruling by this far-right Supreme Court. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, here's the big takeaway, the blockbuster headline. There's a pattern emerging where it seems like 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices actually care about the constitutional rights of people and are showing that they're willing to force the Trump administration to comply with those constitutional rights. And that is something that I don't think any of us could take for granted, because what we just saw was a 7-2 Supreme Court opinion where 7 of the justices said, no, we are going to keep an injunction in place so that no immigrants, no aliens, regardless of their status or lack of status, may be deported by the Trump administration until they get their full due process rights and, importantly, until they get to litigate whether the Trump administration is even entitled to deport them at all under the Alien Enemies Act. So this is something of a constitutional twofer for the people that the Trump administration has been trying to round up and hurry out of the country before these folks could assert their constitutional and statutory rights in court. So this is a really big win. And most importantly, from this old prosecutor's perspective, it is showing that a pattern is emerging of 7 justices, because there were only 2 who still were willing to say, we don't give a rat's ass. That's not exactly how they put it in their dissent. We don't care one whit about the due process constitutional rights of these immigrants, nor do we care if Donald Trump should be able to claim that we're being invaded, basically a military incursion into the United States by the country of Venezuela. We don't care about any of it. Who were those 2 justices? Not hard to figure out. It was Justice Alito. It was Justice Thomas. But here's the thing, Brian. The majority opinion, which was unsigned, but it was joined by the 7 justices in the majority, actually said, quote, we do not find the dissent. In other words, we do not find Alito and Thomas's dissent or their reasoning persuasive. So go ahead and put that in your robe and take it back to chambers with you, Alito and Thomas.
Glenn, to what extent did the Trump administration's defiance of the previous Supreme Court ruling on this similar topic, the topic of, the illegal deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia and their refusal to comply, to what extent do you think that factored into this decision?
It did make an appearance, because the majority opinion is about 8 pages, and they do reference how it sure seems like even when there were some injunctions in place, and even when the Trump administration assured federal judges, no, we don't intend to deport anybody anytime soon, there was an instance where they actually put a bunch of Venezuelan immigrants on a bus, took them out of a detention center and headed out to the airport. And, in the dead of night, the Supreme Court had to put a stop to that. And what we know is those buses turned around after they passed the airport exit. This was down in Texas, and returned those immigrants to the detention facility. So you can't really take the Trump administration at its word. But here is one of my favorite aspects of this ruling, the majority opinion. They actually say, and let me quote from it. They say, the government said, meaning the Trump administration said, it's, quote, unable to provide for the return of an individual deported in error to a prison in El Salvador. That's Abrego Garcia. This means the detainees' interests are particularly weighty. And the beauty of that, Brian? I think everybody recognizes that the Trump administration is lying when they say they can't possibly provide for the return of anybody that they deport to El Salvador, even though Donald Trump, in, I think, a press conference said, of course, I can work with President Bukele and get immigrants returned. But the position they took in court is, nope, it can't be done. So the Supreme Court used that lie and threw it back in the Trump administration's face and said, well, if you're representing that you can't possibly bring anybody back who you admit you wrongfully deported, then guess what? Every immigrant's interests are heightened, are very weighty. So I love when they use a DOJ lie against the DOJ and the Trump administration.
Glenn, do you think it's fair to say that the Trump administration's efforts here have backfired? Because, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that this is a very far-right Supreme Court who would probably pay Trump a hell of a lot of deference, if he didn't rock the boat to the extent that he has, if he didn't defy their rulings or try to take such an extrajudicial approach to all of this. He really could have just coasted along. I mean, these are people who will create out of whole cloth provisions of the Constitution to protect him that don't exist, while ignoring provisions of the Constitution that do exist, again, in order to protect him. And so his decision to take this hostile, aggressive posture, forward-leaning posture against the Supreme Court that was already in his pocket, do you think that this was really just him overplaying his hand?
Yeah, I think it hurt him in the long run. And it's a great question. But here's the thing. If Donald Trump had taken his time and let his DOJ officials sort of methodically work through the issues in court about, for example, whether we're being invaded by Venezuela, such that Donald Trump should even be allowed legally to invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, if they methodically work that through the federal courts, I have a feeling most federal judges would reach the conclusion that, no, we're not under attack by Venezuela. So, of course, you cannot invoke the Alien Enemies Act. Secondarily, if Donald Trump had given all of these immigrants their due process rights, notice, and opportunity to be heard, because the Trump administration denied those constitutional rights to whole planefuls of immigrants that are now unfortunately being detained in a prison in El Salvador. If he had taken his time and worked it through the courts, guess what? He probably would not have been permitted to deport anyone. So he would have succeeded in exactly nothing. So what he did is he got the public relations benefit of, the American people being now told over and over again, oh my gosh, there are all of these immigrants who have been deported, and we've come to learn unconstitutionally so. And isn't that the message that the Trump administration wants to send, not only to the immigrant population, but to all Americans? Because anybody runs the risk of being deported if Donald Trump gets away with it in the first instance against immigrants. So, no, I actually think this was the calculation by Trump. And if he had done it more methodically and in accordance with the rule of law and the Constitution, he probably would have accomplished exactly nothing that he wanted to accomplish.
Is there any atmospheric consequence for Trump as it relates to the Supreme Court by again taking this hostile, forward-leaning posture against the justices here? Could this have some impact in other rulings if they see that they're dealing with a president who has previously defied them as it relates to other matters?
I think the answer is absolutely yes. And I base that on now repeated rulings from the Supreme Court, 190, and then two rulings on this very issue, 7-2. What does that tell us? It tells us that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, all three of whom are typically reliably right conservative justices, they are, it looks like, perhaps losing their patience and no longer prepared to indulge Donald Trump in close calls. Not that I'm suggesting these constitutional violations are close calls. Right. I don't believe they are, but it feels like that Trump has galvanized a whole block of Supreme Court justices who might otherwise have been willing to be a little bit more open to his, minor constitutional dalliances.
Well, they also don't want to give a free pass to the Thomases and Alitos here who see this stuff that is so egregious, so far right, so, again, illegal, unconstitutional, extrajudicial, that even Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts and Neil Gorsuch are seeing this stuff and saying, no, I can't sign my name onto this stuff. People who Donald Trump himself appointed. And so what does it say that we've got people like Thomas and Alito who are still legislating really in a way that's no different from if Jim Jordan or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Trump himself were on the bench?
Yeah, what it says is, we should have learned our lesson when the Alitos and the Thomases of this sad chapter in our nation's history sort of flagrantly and even gleefully violated financial disclosure laws by concealing, incredible in-kind contributions is how I view them from Republican billionaire oligarchs. So, we should have learned our lesson then. And by learning our lesson, DOJ should have initiated investigations. The Congress should have initiated at least an impeachment inquiry to see whether articles of impeachment were appropriate. We did none of it. So now we are stuck with the Thomases and the Alitos. But there's one other thing. I want to give honorable mention to what I perceive as a bit of an FU to Stephen Miller, because not long ago, in recent weeks, Stephen Miller said, and I'm going to paraphrase here, these immigrants don't have due process rights under the Constitution. Remember, he was peddling that a couple of weeks ago. Here is what the Supreme Court 7-justice majority said about that. The Fifth Amendment entitles aliens to due process of law. I call that the FU Stephen Miller passage from this new Supreme Court opinion.
Perfectly put. Well, we will, of course, stay on top of any more updates that we get as far as what the Trump administration is going to do. Again, we're in a situation where, similar to the 9-0 ruling that demanded the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Trump administration now has the decision whether they want to comply or defy the Supreme Court. And we'll know in short order whether they opt to do that as it relates to these other accused migrants who the Trump administration obviously is going to fall over itself to try and deport. So we will stay on top of this. For those who are watching right now, if you'd like to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work and the best way to support independent media more broadly. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.